At the freshman dance at University A, I was following Jonathan, ready to dance the opening waltz with him. Suddenly, a girl hurriedly interrupted us.
Jonathan. I'm back.
Her eyes were slightly red, and they gazed at each other with deep affection, like the protagonists in a novel. The surrounding crowd immediately turned their attention to us, whispering,
"Isn't that Jonathan's childhood sweetheart, Emily?"
Didn't she leave the capital city before? It looks like Jonathan didn't know she was back.
Wow, this is so dramatic.
Jonathan paused for a moment and walked towards her, still holding my hand, so I walked with him. I wasn't the only one who noticed this. Emily looked at our intertwined hands, her eyes reddening further, a tear threatening to fall, making her look pitiful. Before she could speak, I interrupted her.
Jonathan, am I interrupting your reunion? I'll go sit by myself for a while.
I lowered my head and gently shook Jonathan's arm. Jonathan glanced at me and tightened his grip on my hand.
Isn't that the girl from the Jenkins family, the one they brought back a few years ago?
Yes, that girl from the Jenkins family is me. When I was 16, my parents brought me back to the Jenkins family in the capital from a remote town in Jiangnan.
I was born with a congenital heart condition and was a premature baby, so my health had always been poor. My father's career had been advancing rapidly in recent years, attracting many enemies, so they sent me to my mother's hometown, Clearwater Town.
Before I turned 16, I was raised by my grandmother. After she passed away, I was brought back. At that time, there was a dignified woman standing at the door, a graceful girl in a pink dress, and a very handsome boy.
The woman was undoubtedly Mrs. Jenkins, the girl was the housekeeper's child, Emily. The boy was the young Jonathan, who was being groomed by my parents to take over the family business.
Later, I learned that Jonathan was the grandson of my grandfather's comrade-in-arms. That comrade had sacrificed his life to save my grandfather, and Jonathan's parents had also passed away in a car accident. To repay the debt of gratitude, my grandfather brought Jonathan into our family. Given my poor health, my parents decided to groom him as the heir to the Jenkins family.
Mom.
Samantha, this is Jonathan. And this is Emily, Mrs. White's daughter. Mrs. White is our housekeeper. Jonathan and Emily are both a year older than you. You should get along well with them, okay?
Jonathan looked at me with an indifferent expression. I stared at the faint red mole under his eye for a moment. Just as I was about to speak, Emily interrupted me.
Jonathan and I will take good care of you. If you have any questions or need help with anything in the Jenkins household, you can always come to me.
She glanced playfully at Jonathan and said,
Jonathan doesn't like talking to strangers.
Her tone was unusually familiar and intimate. I blinked, bypassed her, and took Jonathan's arm. Emily stood there awkwardly, looking at me in confusion. Jonathan stiffened for a moment but didn't pull his arm away. He looked down at me.
Brother, you are my brother, after all. Why should I ask Miss White about the Jenkins household?
I looked at Jonathan in confusion. He patted my head, and I obediently nuzzled his palm.
Don't worry, I'll take care of everything.
Mrs. Jenkins noticed something was off. She glanced lovingly at Emily.
Of course, your brother will take care of you, but Emily is like a daughter to the Jenkins family too.
I sneered inwardly. All the servants knew that the housekeeper's daughter, Emily, was more like the Jenkins young lady than I was.
From now on, I'll call you Samantha. Come on, I'll show you to your room.
Okay.
I clung to Jonathan's arm, refusing to let go. Surprisingly, he didn't push me away. Emily noticed this too, and her smile stiffened.
This is your room. Tomorrow, I'll take you to school for registration.
Brother, I'm a bit scared since I'm new here. Can you call me tomorrow and go to school with me?
All right, I'll call you tomorrow. Sister.
Good night, brother.
Thanks to the Jenkins family's connections, I skipped a grade and ended up in the same class as Emily and Jonathan. Jonathan held my hand as we walked into the classroom. Or rather, I held his hand tightly, not letting go.
Who's that? Jonathan's girlfriend?
No way. Who could win over someone like Jonathan?
She got out of the Jenkins car, so she must be the real Jenkins' daughter.
Then what's up with Emily? Always riding in the Jenkins car. I thought she was the Jenkins young lady.
Emily, who had come to the classroom with us, heard these comments. She calmly tucked her hair behind her ear and smiled.
Samantha, it's your first time in the capital. You must be feeling out of place. The schools here are quite different from those in Clearwater Town. I'll show you around later.
So she's a country bumpkin, probably some distant relative trying to cozy up to the Jenkins.
I hate those kinds of people. We always have distant relatives trying to get close to us, so manipulative.
I pretended not to hear and ignored her. Then I timidly hid behind Jonathan.
Brother.
She's my sister, the Jenkins young lady. She was unwell and recovering elsewhere.
Hearing Jonathan's words and seeing our tightly clasped hands, everyone fell silent, except for a few who whispered.
Wow. She really is the Jenkins' daughter.
I thought Emily was the Jenkins young lady. She always talks about the Jenkins family as if she has their last name.
Emily's expression darkened, and she walked away awkwardly. She glanced at me before silently returning to her seat. Jonathan led me to our seats, and I sat next to him. I dozed off during the first class, resting my head on the desk. Due to my poor health, the Jenkins family didn't plan to groom me into some elite. They just sent me to recuperate. When I expressed an interest in painting, they let me pursue it. Jonathan was to inherit the family business and take care of me in the future. As a result, my grades were average, and skipping a grade made them even worse. Naturally, I slept a lot. When the bell rang, waking me up, I found myself leaning on Jonathan's shoulder. Groggily, I looked up at him. He was working on some problems, his defined jawline and exquisite profile in view.
Sleeping on the desk isn't comfortable.
Oh!
I didn't think much of it and wrapped my arm around his left arm, which wasn't writing. Then I leaned on his shoulder and continued to sleep. I inhaled the pine scent from Jonathan and fell into a deep sleep. So I didn't notice the strange looks from everyone. As the heir of the Jenkins family, Jonathan excelled in both academics and appearance. He was also socially adept, handling any situation with ease. He was well known among his peers in high society. However, he was too aloof, with few close friends and no girlfriend. He was also known for disliking physical contact. Holding his hand was one thing, but now I was sleeping on his shoulder for 2 classes, which surprised everyone. But over the next few months, everyone got used to it. Because not only did I sleep on his shoulder during class, but I also clung to him while walking, holding his hand or arm, and would throw myself into his arms at the slightest provocation. Later, everyone knew that Samantha, the eldest daughter of the Jenkins family, was very good at being charming. But only to Jonathan.
Brother, aren't I amazing?
Whether it was finishing a meal with less left over, completing a bit of homework, or even staying awake during a class, people would see Samantha looking at Jonathan with her big, grape-like eyes and saying this, then nuzzling her head against his hand.
Yes, Samantha, you are.
Over time, he didn't need any hints from her, he would often pat her head or pinch her cheeks. Thus, everyone knew that the Jenkins family had a cherished daughter who had just returned to the capital, and she was the sister Jonathan adored. Only Samantha knew that Jonathan, despite his cold demeanor, treated her so well from the beginning because he felt guilty. He had taken her place, enjoyed the resources of the Jenkins family, and the affection of Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins. The more guilty he felt, the more he doted on her. The superficial gestures that Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins didn't make, the face they didn't give her, Samantha borrowed Jonathan's hand to perfectly integrate into this circle. She also enrolled in a university as an art student with Jonathan. Emily, however, didn't have enough points and eventually got into a university through the Jenkins family's connections. She and her mother had to go back to their hometown to handle some paperwork. Jonathan had asked for this favor for her. Back to the present, Jonathan was holding Samantha's hand, and Emily looked at them with some sadness.
Jonathan, since you opened the dance with Samantha, you can't refuse to play the duet with me later, right?
Emily asked with a smile, but her eyes were red as she looked at Jonathan.
Okay.
Samantha withdrew her hand from Jonathan's.
Go ahead, brother.
Jonathan and Emily sat side by side at the piano, playing Chopin with perfect harmony. Under the stage lights, they looked like a pair made in heaven. Samantha heard the sound of cameras clicking around her and various whispers like they look so good together and I'm so envious. She silently stared at the two on stage. Having studied in Clearwater Town until she was 16, Samantha had never been exposed to the piano, while Emily had been able to take lessons with Jonathan. Their accumulated tacit understanding over the years was naturally unmatched by others.
Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Samantha's head, and amidst the exclamations of those around her, she suddenly collapsed. In a daze, she saw Jonathan rushing down from the stage in a panic and picking her up.
Samantha!
That was the last thing she heard before losing consciousness. A flood of memories surged into her mind, revealing that she was living in a romance novel. The male lead was Jonathan, and the female lead was Emily. The story mainly revolved around their childhood friendship and eventual reunion. Samantha was the antagonist, frequently causing misunderstandings between the male and female leads. In the end, everyone saw through her true nature, and Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins were disappointed in her, disowning her as their daughter. She was left penniless, and Jonathan gave her some money to live on her own. However, affected by rumors, she eventually succumbed to a heart condition. The male and female leads ended up happily together. But she only had a rough memory of the plot, not the details. When she sorted out these memories and opened her eyes again, she was staring at the hospital ceiling. I struggled to lift my hand and tried to sit up, only to find Jonathan asleep by my bedside. There were faint dark circles under his eyes, and he looked tired. I couldn't help but reach out and touch his eyelashes, then his high nose bridge. At that moment, Jonathan opened his eyes. He looked at me and then grabbed my wandering hand.
Samantha, you've been unconscious for a whole day and night. The doctor said your heart might have been under some stress, and you need to rest for a few days.
Suddenly, Samantha noticed a figure at the door. She wrapped her arms around Jonathan's waist and buried her head in his chest.
Brother, I don't want to stay in the hospital. Take me home.
Jonathan instinctively held her, gently stroking her long hair, and agreed. The figure at the door stiffened and then turned and ran away. It was the female lead, Emily. Jonathan called the Jenkins family's driver to pick them up. He was so exhausted that he fell asleep in the car. Samantha sat beside him, bored, and checked the school's forum. It was filled with discussions about Jonathan rushing down from the stage to hold her, and there were even photos of her lying in his arms.
In the novel, the male and female leads duet wasn't interrupted by me. They caused a sensation on campus and became a legendary story at a university. But now...
Is that Jonathan's sister? They seem so close. Jonathan looks so worried.
Cheerful, not really related, but everyone pretty much knows.
Excited, I was there. The girl is Samantha, super pretty. She fainted and almost scared Jonathan to death. I've never seen him like that.
No one cared about Emily and Jonathan's performance anymore. Samantha zoomed in on the photo, satisfied, and saved it.
Serious, as for being manipulative. I admit I am. But all I ever wanted was my rightful share of the Jenkins family business and to live a healthy life.
Samantha glanced at Jonathan, who had fallen asleep next to her, sighed, and gently rested his head on her shoulder. She turned to look out the window, no longer looking at him. Emily returned to the Jenkins household and could be seen every day, busying herself around the house, making desserts for Mrs. Jenkins, or directing the servants in the garden. Now she was in the living room, making Mrs. Jenkins laugh heartily. Jonathan sat beside them, making tea for Mrs. Jenkins. It was a very harmonious scene. As soon as Samantha entered, their laughter abruptly stopped. A few seconds later, Mrs. Jenkins nodded slightly.
Friendly, Samantha's back.
Then she continued chatting and laughing with Emily, holding her hand.
Sad, I've been in the Jenkins household for 3 years. I've tried to get close to my parents, but perhaps because we've been estranged for too long, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins treat me more like a well-mannered guest.
In contrast, Emily, who has always lived with the Jenkins family, is more favored by Mrs. Jenkins. She receives the same, if not better, treatment than Samantha.
Cheerful, I even want to adopt Emily as my daughter.
At that time, Emily shyly glanced at Jonathan and playfully refused. Samantha smiled and greeted them, deliberately avoiding looking at Jonathan for reasons she couldn't quite understand. She went upstairs alone, staring blankly at the teddy bear on the table.
Whispering, it's from my first birthday after arriving at the Jenkins household. Jonathan had taken Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins to the mall for dinner and bought it for me.
They had planned to take Samantha to a high-end store to get custom-made clothes, but she shook her head and pointed at the teddy bear in the window.
Cheerful, just this one.
For subsequent birthdays, Jonathan always celebrated with her, but Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins were never present again. The gifts were nothing more than sets of luxury items.
Sad, I recalled those awakening memories, the disdainful looks Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins gave me in the novel's ending.
She took a deep breath and threw the teddy bear into the cabinet. Looking at herself in the mirror, after 3 years of being showered with money, she had become a beautiful, wealthy young lady. She tugged at the corners of her mouth, and the person in the mirror responded with a sweet smile, dimples faintly showing on both cheeks.
Whispering, it's just a storyline.
Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. She composed herself and went to open it, revealing Jonathan's face. He was tall, casting a faint shadow that almost completely enveloped her. Jonathan patted her head, and she instinctively nuzzled his palm, putting on a lively and cheerful smile.
Cheerful, brother. What's up? Missed me after just 2 days?
Jonathan looked at her intently, with an emotion she couldn't quite understand in his eyes. After a long while, he sighed softly and pinched her cheeks with both hands.
Gentle, dummy.
Surprised, what, ow.
Cheerful, let's go. I'll take you to eat something delicious.
They went to a newly opened French restaurant. Jonathan, unusually, allowed Samantha to have a little red wine. Clearly, she had never drunk before and had no idea about her alcohol tolerance. Jonathan only let her have 2 small glasses, but she still felt a bit tipsy.
Excited, this place is so good, brother. I never had these things when I was little.
He looked at her, gently and naturally touching her face.
Gentle, I'll take you here often. You can have whatever you want.
Samantha just smiled without saying anything, rubbing her warm cheek against his palm. What if what she wanted was the family fortune? Would he agree to that too? After a while, Samantha felt the alcohol getting to her, so she jumped onto Jonathan's back, demanding he carry her. With the alcohol in her system, she started babbling nonsense on his back.
Drunk, brother. The main character. I want to be the main character too, boo-hoo. Or the female lead. Clearly, I'm more innocent, so why am I not the female lead? I have a teddy bear, bought by my brother. But it seems I don't have a brother, or parents. I only had my grandma, but then she was gone too.
Jonathan quietly listened, carrying her on the overpass. It was late, and there were only a few passers-by. It wasn't until she finished her last sentence that he stopped and interrupted her.
Serious, you have a brother.
He turned his head slightly, his profile as cool and serene as the moonlight. Samantha lay on his shoulder, their noses almost touching. She stared at him, dazed. She was silent for a long time, so he continued walking slowly with her on his back. The night breeze lifted the strands of hair on her shoulders, some of which tangled around his neck. I murmured softly,
Jonathan, if there's a next life.
It was the first time I called him by his full name instead of brother. He paused, waiting for me to continue. But when he turned around, he found that I had already fallen into a deep sleep on his shoulder. The next day, I woke up with no memory of what happened. Trying to stay calm, I asked Jonathan if I had done anything. He just shook his head and said I had been very well behaved. I sighed in relief and started preparing for the next important event, the birthday party for Mrs. Jenkins. The day before the party, Mrs. Jenkins took Emily and me to pick out dresses. Rows of designer evening gowns were delivered to the Jenkins mansion. There were 2 haute couture dresses for the season, one black and one white, each worth a fortune. I finally stopped in front of the short black strapless evening gown, ready to try it on. But suddenly, a hand stopped me.
Samantha, could you let me have this one?
No, I can't.
Emily's eyes instantly reddened, and she spoke with a choked voice.
Samantha, I don't know why you don't like me, but I've always given in to you. Can't you let me have this dress just this once?
She then turned to Mrs. Jenkins and said firmly,
It's Mrs. Jenkins' birthday, and she's taken such good care of me. This is really important to me.
I looked at her with difficulty and shook my head.
I really can't.
She started to sob.
You have so many dresses to choose from. Why do you have to take this one from me?
Mrs. Jenkins, hearing this, was very moved. She put her arm around Emily's shoulder, soothing her trembling back. Then she looked at me disapprovingly.
The Jenkins family has taught you for 3 years, and you still can't get rid of your petty ways? It's just a dress. Why do you have to fight with Emily over it?
I seemed to be provoked by her words. I turned to look at Emily, trying to keep my voice steady.
You always give in to me? When have I ever made things difficult for you? Isn't the Jenkins family my home? I'm the legitimate heir of the Jenkins family. How many benefits have you taken from the Jenkins family over the years?
I pointed at the evening gown, my eyes reddening.
A haute couture dress worth hundreds of thousands. How can a housekeeper's daughter afford it? You eat and wear the same things as I do. Does your mother's salary of less than $10,000 cover the clothes you're wearing? What are you trying to prove here?
Emily stepped back a few steps, tears streaming down her face. She kept shaking her head.
No. I just treat Mrs. Jenkins as my own mother. I didn't know these things were so expensive. If you mind, I'll give everything back to you.
Fine, then you'd better not take a penny from the Jenkins family and stop accepting any expensive items.
Emily cried, biting her lip, stubbornly nodding. Mrs. Jenkins also looked at me in shock, barely concealing her anger.
Haven't we treated you well enough? How could you harbor such thoughts? I treat Emily like my own daughter. What's wrong with giving her these things? Can't you learn from Emily's generosity and kindness?
Yes, you treat Emily like your own daughter and Jonathan like your own son. Only I, an outsider, am in the way of your perfect life.
Mrs. Jenkins was stung by my words. Her eyes suddenly cleared a bit, and she hurriedly said,
No, Samantha, that's not what I meant.
I closed my eyes, ignoring Mrs. Jenkins, and took the white dress upstairs. Once the door was closed, the sadness and pain on my face disappeared. I smirked. In the original story, I had chosen this white dress, and Emily also wanted it. Because of Mrs. Jenkins' favoritism, the dress eventually went to her. But now, I had chosen the black dress, and Emily still came to fight for it. I successfully played the victim and got the dress I liked. More importantly, since Emily agreed not to take anything, she wouldn't be able to attend the party tomorrow. In the original story, she was drugged, and her relationship with Jonathan progressed rapidly. None of that could happen now. It seemed Emily didn't really like the dress. She just wanted to fight with me and use it as an excuse to say those heartfelt words to Mrs. Jenkins. As expected, within an hour, Jonathan rushed back to the Jenkins mansion. I listened carefully to the footsteps. He seemed to ignore Emily, who was still sitting in the living room, and went straight upstairs. Then, my door was knocked on. I pinched my thigh, forcing out a few tears to make myself look pitiful. When I opened the door, I saw Jonathan's handsome face and the many desserts he knew I loved.
Brother, boo-hoo!
I pretended to sob and called out to him. Then I threw myself at him, hugging him tightly. Jonathan skillfully used his free hand to support me, easily carrying me into the room. I pretended to be sad, burying my head in his shoulder, but inside, I was overjoyed. Smelling his fresh scent, the indescribable gloom in my heart suddenly disappeared.
Samantha, be good. Whatever dress you like, I'll buy it for you.
This scene was familiar. For the past 3 years, whenever I fought with Emily over something, it always ended with Mrs. Jenkins and the Jenkins staff favoring her. And soon after, Jonathan would come back with something I liked, sometimes my favorite desserts, sometimes beautiful clothes or jewelry. Then I would get a hug from my brother. Thus, all the biased and unfair events that should have caused me pain and humiliation became insignificant, even tinged with a bit of sweetness. I could feel that everyone cared more about Emily, except for Jonathan. He cared more about me.
But why did you ask for her admission opportunity? Why did you play the piano with her when she asked? Why, brother?
In Jonathan's embrace, perhaps out of fear of the answers, I never voiced these questions. In the end, I succumbed to his embrace and comfort, falling into a deep sleep. A night of good dreams.
A grand banquet, glasses clinking. I stood beside Mrs. Jenkins, wearing a sweet yet insincere smile, constantly socializing.
I'm glad you're here with me today.
Perhaps out of guilt, or maybe she was clearer-headed after what I said yesterday. Today I stood beside Mrs. Jenkins instead of Emily.
Oh no, this was my rightful place all along.
And Emily, after what I said yesterday, naturally had to maintain her image of not being after the Jenkins family's wealth. She stubbornly refused the dress and the invitation to the banquet. But perhaps she didn't expect that no one would repeatedly invite her. Her face looked quite unpleasant when she saw us off to the banquet this morning.
Let me introduce you to some people.
Maybe because of yesterday's events, Mrs. Jenkins felt a bit guilty and held my hand, gently introducing me to the various people at the event and the complex relationships between the enterprises. I pretended to listen intently, but in reality, I had already memorized these social connections in the elite circles of the capital over the past 3 years by Jonathan's side.
It's nice to meet you all.
I stood beside Mrs. Jenkins, wearing a custom-made white dress, making the most of it. Sweet, pure, with a hint of coolness, like a bright crescent moon in the sky. Unconsciously, more and more people's eyes focused on me.
You seem very knowledgeable about the Jenkins projects.
Stocks, funds, even the Jenkins ongoing collaboration projects. I can answer everything.
Mrs. Jenkins' gaze grew more and more surprised, and even Mr. Jenkins frequently looked our way.
Everything I displayed today had been prepared since the day I returned to the Jenkins family. From the beginning, I knew exactly what I wanted.
After socializing with important guests, I breathed a sigh of relief and suddenly felt a bit dizzy. Mrs. Jenkins supported me and suggested I rest upstairs in the hotel. I agreed. In fact, when Emily wasn't around, Mrs. Jenkins treated me quite well, fitting the role of a distant yet busy mother who tried to show concern for me. However, as soon as Emily was present, Mrs. Jenkins would suddenly become harsh, biased, and unreasonable. I could only attribute this to the 10+ years of relationship between Mrs. Jenkins and Emily. Over time, I gradually gave up any hope of familial affection from the Jenkins family.
I will rest for a bit.
I wasn't fully aware that since this was a novel, there must be a protagonist's halo. I got a room key from a waiter and went upstairs. Lying on the bed to rest, I felt increasingly dizzy, and my face began to flush unnaturally. Something was wrong.
Damn it!
My face changed drastically as I suddenly remembered the plot from the original novel. In the novel, Emily was supposed to be secretly drugged by a malicious female character who admired Jonathan, and a dubious man was supposed to be sent into her hotel room. However, the female lead accidentally entered Jonathan's room, and their relationship rapidly intensified. But since Emily didn't attend the banquet today, I had naturally overlooked this part of the plot. Unexpectedly, the drugging scene had shifted to me. And without the protagonist's halo, I hadn't made it to Jonathan's room.
I need to get out of here.
I recalled the sherry and the waiter who gave me the room key, biting my lip in frustration at my carelessness. My body grew weaker, and my cheeks became burning hot. I tried to get up and leave the room but couldn't move. I couldn't even reach my phone to make a call. Despair slowly welled up inside me. I bit my lip hard to stay conscious until my mouth was filled with the taste of blood.
Jonathan, please.
With my last bit of strength, I tapped my phone screen 3 times, triggering the automatic emergency contact message function. Footsteps grew closer, and my heart sank. A stranger swiped the room key and entered.
I tried to stay calm, keeping my eyes open to remember this person's appearance and the details of being drugged, thinking about how to gather evidence later. A stranger slapped me hard, and I could feel my face swelling up immediately. Fear and pain overwhelmed me, and tears streamed down my face without me realizing it. I wanted to fight back but couldn't move.
Just as the stranger started to tear my dress off my shoulder, I heard the door being violently kicked open.
Get away from her!
Jonathan charged at the stranger with a force that could have been lethal. He had been practicing martial arts since he was young, and the man had no chance to fight back and begged for mercy, but Jonathan didn't stop. His eyes were red, and it was the first time I had seen such a terrifying expression on his face.
Brother.
Jonathan finally stopped, carefully picked me up, and I saw that his hand was even stained with blood.
Samantha, I'm here. It's okay, don't be afraid. I'll take you to the hospital right away.
I couldn't hold on any longer and fainted in his arms. I knew the original plot and who had drugged me, a malicious girl who liked Jonathan. Mr. Jenkins wanted to settle the matter privately because the malicious girl was also the daughter of a large corporation, and she promised to give a big project to the Jenkins family.
You weren't actually harmed, so why not take this opportunity to help the family? This project is very important. For the sake of the Jenkins family, you should make a little sacrifice. Besides, as a girl, this incident wouldn't be good for your reputation if it got out.
My heart felt like it had fallen into an icy abyss. Although I had long since given up hope for the Jenkins family, I couldn't help but feel resentment at this moment. I looked at Mrs. Jenkins, who hesitated but ultimately remained silent.
No. I've already called the police.
After waking up in the hospital, the first thing I did was find someone to gather evidence. However, Jonathan told me he had already collected all the evidence and reported it to the police. He had anticipated that Mr. Jenkins would accept the other party's terms and settle the matter privately. So he took me directly to the police to file a report and make a statement.
What? Fine, fine. Did Jonathan teach you to do this? In that case, you too can bear the loss of this cooperation.
Mr. Jenkins stormed out, and Mrs. Jenkins looked at me, wanting to say something but ultimately following him out without a word. Mr. Jenkins was a thorough businessman, only seeing profit. An unfamiliar daughter and a foster child in the family couldn't compare to the interests of the Jenkins family in his eyes. I gripped the bedsheet tightly, feeling nauseous. The Jenkins family was like a luxurious golden castle, looking glamorous on the outside but rotten and decayed on the inside.
At first, I returned to the Jenkins family out of unwillingness. Why should a foster child and a housekeeper's daughter enjoy what should have been mine? I was the only daughter of the Jenkins family, and I wanted to reclaim my inheritance. However, now I just wanted to leave the Jenkins family as soon as possible, and my desire for their wealth had gradually faded. I had a talent and passion for painting, and I had already made quite a bit of money from it, enough to support myself. For the past 3 years, I had been wearing a mask and acting. Everything here made me feel disgusted, except for Jonathan.
The person I should have hated the most. I remembered how he rushed in to save me, how he watched over me by my hospital bed. And then I recalled what Mr. Jenkins had just said, and I couldn't help but worry.
It's okay. The Jenkins family treats him well. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins both favor him. After I leave, he can inherit the Jenkins family without any obstacles. He'll be fine.
But there was still a lingering unease. This unease grew when Jonathan didn't come to see me all day. In the days following the incident, Jonathan had been almost excessively attentive, fearing I would be traumatized. He had never gone a whole day without seeing me like today. The last message on my phone was from this morning when I asked him, "Where are you, brother?" He still hadn't replied.
Just as I was about to grab my clothes and go to his office or school to find him, my phone suddenly rang. It was a message from Jonathan, "Busy today, will be back late. Go to bed early." His tone was normal, and I breathed a sigh of relief.
Late at night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, thinking about how to leave the Jenkins family when I heard footsteps. I recognized them as Jonathan's. Narrator, tone, serious. He seemed to have reached my door, his footsteps very light. I held my breath and listened carefully. It sounded like he was heading upstairs.
Why is he back so late? I frowned, recalling Mr. Jenkins' words from earlier and Jonathan's sudden late return. I quietly opened my door and followed him. He entered Mr. Jenkins' study. Suddenly, the sound of a vase shattering echoed from inside.
Narrator, tone, terrified. I stopped, standing at the study door, straining to hear the conversation inside.
You've got some nerve handling this behind my back. Do you know how much money that project could bring in? How beneficial it would be for the Jenkins family.
Samantha is your biological daughter.
Of course, I know. Hasn't the Jenkins family treated her well? She wasn't hurt, so why can't we just move past this? I raised her, can't she make some sacrifices for the Jenkins family? She'll have to marry for the family's benefit sooner or later.
Narrator, tone, calm. I listened to Mr. Jenkins' words with a surprising sense of calm. Then, there was the sound of something falling and a muffled groan from Jonathan.
Narrator, tone, terrified. My heart skipped a beat, a sense of foreboding washing over me.
Don't think the Jenkins family's future is in your hands. As long as I'm alive, the company stands.
Your grandfather left that large inheritance to ensure we took care of you. Most of the Jenkins family's assets came from your grandfather. Even though your registration hasn't been transferred, the Jenkins family has invested a lot in you. You and the Jenkins family are in the same boat. Stop doing foolish things.
Silence.
Narrator, tone, serious. So, most of the Jenkins family's wealth actually came from Jonathan's grandfather? Jonathan's registration wasn't even with the Jenkins family, so where did his inheritance rights come from? How is this any different from being completely cut off? Narrator, tone, hopeful. Outside the door, I covered my mouth tightly, my heart pounding. My mind raced, trying to process all this information. Wait, something's not right.
Narrator, tone, terrified. After hearing another muffled thud, I quickly pushed open the door and saw the scene. Jonathan, pale-faced, was half kneeling on the ground, while Mr. Jenkins was hitting him with a baseball bat.
Dad, what are you doing? I tried to hide my disgust for Mr. Jenkins, pretending to have just discovered their situation. Why are you hitting my brother? Is it because we called the police? Blame me instead. I helped Jonathan up, trying to lead him out.
Narrator, tone, sad. However, from the moment I entered, Jonathan's face had turned even paler, his eyes downcast. I pulled him, but he didn't move. Tears streamed down my face uncontrollably, my voice choked and almost unrecognizable.
Brother, come with me. Please.
Relieved, all right, Samantha. Jonathan couldn't refuse his crying sister, so he silently followed me back to the room. Before leaving the study, Mr. Jenkins gave me a meaningful look, but I couldn't care less. Because Jonathan's injuries looked severe.
Narrator, tone, sad. Jonathan sat with his back to me. I lifted his shirt and saw the bruises and scars crisscrossing his skin. There were fresh wounds and old scars. I had thought he was living a good life in the Jenkins household. Silently, I fetched the first aid kit and carefully applied medicine to his wounds.
Samantha, it's okay. I turned my face away, continuing to apply the medicine, my expression dark. After finishing, I pressed him to sit on the bed and stared at him without saying a word. Tears fell again. For the first time, I realized how much of a crybaby I was. My tears seemed endless.
Narrator, tone, sad. I just kept looking at him, tears streaming down my face. Jonathan let out a barely audible sigh. He raised his slender hand, his jade-like face slightly frowning, gently touching my head and carefully wiping away my tears. My gentle brother, even now, only wanted to comfort his crying sister. But we had no blood relation, not even on the same household register. We should have been strangers. Only because of your kindness, Jonathan. Do you know that your gentle touch does not bring me peace? On the contrary. Jonathan's pupils dilated as he saw his sister, held gently in his hands, kiss him with an undeniable force. Lingering, sucking.
I will never call you brother again, Jonathan.
That day, Jonathan almost fled in panic. And I began to organize the things I had. It was the recording of Jonathan and Mr. Jenkins talking in the study that day. There was also a copied file from Mr. Jenkins' computer. I had secretly copied it a long time ago to understand the company's operations.
I found the property transfer agreement, Jonathan's grandfather's transfer, to Mr. Jenkins and Jonathan.
The names in the document were blurred, and I hadn't paid much attention to it. After this incident, I realized it was Jonathan's grandfather's asset transfer. The numbers were staggering. I frowned. The document was incomplete and not enough to serve as legally binding evidence. Understanding this, I sent Jonathan a text message.
I'm hungry. I want to eat at that French restaurant we went to last time.
Since I had kissed Jonathan forcefully, he had been staying in the school dormitory and hadn't returned to the Jenkins house. After cooling down for so long, he should have figured things out. I pursed my lips. Jonathan replied 5 minutes later.
Okay.
I changed into a camisole that was very different from my usual style and applied a bright lip color. I checked Jonathan's class schedule and planned to pick him up from school. I strolled leisurely through the university campus. It was the season when cherry blossoms were in full bloom. I sniffed the floral scent and slowly relaxed. Living in the complex environment of the Jenkins house, I had always been scheming and plotting to get what I wanted as quickly as possible. But I had never truly experienced a day of my own university life. My heart strangely calmed down. Suddenly, I heard an unwelcome voice.
Samantha.
It was Emily. She bit her lip and looked at me expressionlessly. She didn't bother to pretend to call me Samantha dear anymore. For the past 3 years, I had always played the weakling. When Emily acted like a white lotus, I acted even more innocent. So, except for Mrs. Jenkins' unreasonable favoritism, she had never succeeded in suppressing me, whether at school or in social circles.
What's the matter?
Emily froze for a moment, then stared at me with some resentment.
What did you say to Mrs. Jenkins? Why hasn't she talked to me these past few days? And Jonathan, he hardly talks to me since he started university.
Tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Jenkins? I frowned and suddenly noticed that Emily seemed different. In the past, although Emily's looks were only considered delicate, she had an indescribable aura and charm that always drew people to her. But now, that aura surrounding her had disappeared. She looked just like any ordinary college student on the street. A ridiculous thought slowly rose in my mind. The protagonist's halo. I stared at her, slowly confirming my suspicion. Emily's protagonist halo was gradually fading. Jonathan had never fallen in love with her from the beginning. The most affected person, Mrs. Jenkins, might have also lost her inexplicable favoritism towards Emily due to the significant deviation in the plot.
Emily, what have you been after all these years?
She was stunned.
The Jenkins family has nothing to do with you. Haven't you already gotten enough? I know your sneaky thoughts. I've countered every little trick you've played. Except for Mrs. Jenkins' bias, you haven't won against me in any other way. Compared to me, you did get Mrs. Jenkins' love, but you already have a biological mother who loves you more. If these, or some benefits from the Jenkins family, are what you want, then please don't bother me anymore. I don't want any of these things.
I smiled at her, revealing my dimples.
I find them disgusting.
Emily looked at me, bewildered and unable to comprehend.
Confused, you.
I dropped my smile, crossed my arms, and looked down at her slightly.
Serious, Jonathan is mine. Stay away from him.
A classic line from a villainous character. I couldn't help but applaud myself inwardly and chuckle a bit. Without looking at Emily's expression, I turned and walked away, planning a graceful exit. However, after only a few steps, I ran into Jonathan, who was leaning against the wall. His expression was calm, and his long eyelashes cast a shadow under his eyes. Who knows how long he had been listening?
It's over. The pure and innocent persona was completely ruined.
I tugged at the corner of my mouth, about to speak, but he beat me to it.
Relieved, let's go, I'll take you to eat.
I instantly smiled, my eyes curving, and subtly changed our hand-holding to interlocking fingers. Jonathan didn't object. Neither of us looked at Emily again. Jonathan and I sat in a private room.
Jonathan handed me a stack of documents. They were detailed evidence of Mr. Jenkins misappropriating the property Jonathan's grandfather had given him, along with several loopholes in the Jenkins family's accounts. It wasn't enough to send him to prison, but it could make the Jenkins family return all the money they had taken over the years. I wasn't surprised that Jonathan had these. He wasn't one to sit and wait for things to happen. These documents were probably the result of his years in the Jenkins household.
Serious, I hesitated about whether to do this. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins are your biological parents, after all.
Serious, I have no feelings for the Jenkins family. All these years, it was just a matter of not wanting to give up and wanting to fight for the inheritance. As for familial affection, I gave up on that long ago. Besides, this was yours to begin with. I thought you were living well in the Jenkins household, but it turns out.
I didn't continue. Jonathan shook his head and smiled, patting my head.
Serious, I understand. I'm sorry for the times I didn't know about, for the grievances you suffered.
Serious, it's nothing. I'm not really a helpless fool. I didn't let myself suffer any losses. I don't care about that so-called familial affection.
I stood up and smoothed my dress. Next to the dining table was a large floor-to-ceiling window, offering a panoramic view of the brightly lit city. But I didn't look at it. I walked straight to Jonathan.
Serious, there were only 2 times I felt truly hurt. Once when you pleaded for Emily to get into a university, and once when you agreed to play a duet with her.
Jonathan looked at me, his expression unreadable. The mole under his eye looked even more alluring in the dim light.
Serious, I helped Emily because Mrs. White took good care of me over the years. All these years in the Jenkins household, it was all scheming or Mr. Jenkins's harsh treatment. When I was a child, Mrs. White would secretly apply medicine for me. After I grew up, Mr. Jenkins rarely hit me anymore, couldn't beat me, but he always used the inheritance and you to threaten me.
Surprised, me?
Jonathan stood up and reached out to touch my cheek. Even though this intimate gesture had been done countless times, I still couldn't help my heart from pounding.
Serious, he knew I liked you.
With a loud boom, my heart felt like it exploded with fireworks. My head was spinning, unable to think, and I could only accept his kiss in a daze.
I like you too. I've liked you for so long, so much that I thought I would go crazy.
I hugged him tightly, rubbing my head against his chest.
Let's go somewhere special.
Jonathan said he would cook something for me at home, but the car headed not towards the Jenkins house but to an apartment in a luxurious neighborhood.
I've been investing over the years and made some money. I bought this apartment myself. For the day I could leave the Jenkins house.
I pushed open the door. Though it wasn't as grand as the Jenkins mansion, it was still spacious and decorated warmly, just the way I liked it.
Looks like you've been planning to bring me here for a while.
Jonathan pinched my cheek and nodded with a smile. Then he went to the kitchen to cook noodles for me. I happily ate the noodles he made with love and gained a handsome boyfriend I had longed for. Feeling carefree, I stayed there for the next few days. Jonathan and I went to classes together, and after class, he would take me to my favorite restaurants or cook for me himself. In the evenings, we would cuddle on the couch watching movies, and I could get kisses just by being sweet. Or in the study, he would read financial books and investment materials while I drew beside him.
During this time, Mrs. Jenkins called twice, but I brushed her off. 2 months later, Jonathan told me he had submitted evidence to the court and won the lawsuit. We went to the Jenkins house together.
You ungrateful brats! I raised you for so many years, and this is how you repay me.
How much of the Jonathan family's wealth did you take, and how much did you earn using those assets? I'm just taking back what's rightfully mine.
Mr. Jenkins slumped on the couch. Mrs. Jenkins stood beside him, silent, just watching us. She wasn't surprised, so she must have known about all this.
Samantha. Mom was wrong. I was under a spell before. Don't leave, okay? Mom will treat you well from now on.
I looked at these two people, my biological mother and father. For the past decade, they hadn't fulfilled their duties for a single day. Aside from some cold, hard cash, which was even from the Jonathan family's assets. How laughable.
I let out a cold laugh, not answering, nor did I look at them again. Then I took Jonathan's hand and walked out of the cage that had trapped us for so long.
I looked up at the clear sky and took a deep breath. A new life was beginning.
A year later, most of the Jenkins assets were returned to Jonathan. Jonathan paid back the money we had used from the Jenkins family over the years. Even so, the Jenkins business rapidly declined, and with many enemies already, it was now on the verge of collapse. The woman who had wronged me and her accomplices were sentenced. Mrs. White was dismissed from the Jenkins house, and Emily, who got into a university through connections, was exposed and expelled.
I became a somewhat famous artist and made a lot of money. So I jokingly told Jonathan I wanted to support him.
Jonathan laughed and agreed, then showed me his company's revenue.
I was so shocked I covered my mouth. Well, being a freeloader isn't so bad.
Our relationship didn't change much, except I became more clingy, and he spoiled me even more, making up for the love I lacked over the past decade. I had vowed not to call him brother anymore, and I did, except in certain moments.
He liked to coax me into calling him brother while whispering in my ear. So I could only cry and call him brother in trembling. Jonathan and I were like two drifting pieces of duckweed in the world, each other's only family and lover. At 25, Jonathan accompanied me to Norway. We visited the Sogndfjord, the town of Rosendal, and Tromsø to see the whales. Finally, under the dazzling aurora, he knelt on one knee and proposed to me.
I stared at him in a daze, tears welling up in my eyes, nodding, joyfully and chokingly nodding. I do.
From our youth to now, you've given me all the warmth, illuminating every moment of my life, and I remember it all. The mole under your eye, the scars on your back, the marks you've left on me, and the warmth of your lips, I remember it all. I love you, and I do.